Hello, and welcome to another session of the world's 100 greatest books, brought to you by IntelliQuest. In the next few minutes, we'll explore a superb novel of Regency England, and one of the most popular novels in the English language, Pride and Prejudice. You'll also learn about its brilliant author, Jane Austen, and the times in which she lived and wrote. Jane Austen was born in 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire, England. She was one of 8 children of the village rector, who was qualified to educate her at home. Her family was lively and affectionate, and all were great novel readers. On the surface, her life was quiet and uneventful, yet Austen's mind was enormously vital, and the scope of her talents was astounding. Perhaps most remarkable of all, Austen wrote all 6 of her novels before she was even 22 years old. Yet each one reveals deep insight and understanding into human character and behavior, and a compassion for human follies and flaws. Jane Austen was a keen observer of the landed gentry and country folk who became the subjects of her novels. She was able to portray them with wit and charm, and her stories offer a unique glimpse into village life in England's late 18th century. Austen is noted for her ironic point of view, for the playful way in which she mocks the manners and values that marked her time, and which often seemed superficial and vain. She is also known for her rich characterizations, and particularly for her lively and spirited heroines. She had a deep respect for intelligence, and it was the mental and rational abilities of her protagonists that enabled them to stand above the other characters. She rejected the popular Gothic novels of her times, and turned her back on the usual plots and characters of Romanticism. She is one of the first English novelists to write about life as it actually was, and although her settings and subjects are strictly middle class, within that class were a diversity of personality types that provided a splendid variety of characters. In her personal life, Austen turned her back on the potential for fame and on the literary circles of her times, writing and publishing her books anonymously. 2 of them, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, were not even published until after her death. All 6 of Jane Austen's novels are comedies of manners, and all revolve around the complications of courtship and marriage. Although the author herself never married, she demonstrates a sharp and amusing insight into that institution, and many of her observations are as relevant today as they were in the 18th century. Pride and Prejudice is easily Austen's most popular novel, and was probably the writer's own favorite. She referred to it as her own darling child, and it was an immediate success when it was released in 1813, when she was 38 years old. To understand Pride and Prejudice, it is helpful to understand how Austen herself defined those characteristics. She defined pride as an unrealistic exaggeration of one's importance that results in discourtesy and unjust or offensive treatment of others. And she defined prejudice as the act of judging someone before the facts are known. But she is careful to distinguish the pride that stems from egotism and snobbery from pride based on self-esteem, independence, and dignity, the latter of which is a virtue. In English society of the early 19th century, there were very distinct ranks, orders, and classes. These distinctions were formal and acknowledged by all, and they were largely based on wealth derived from ownership of land. Single men with inheritances of land or estates were considered desirable pieces of property, particularly by the mothers of young girls who hoped to improve their family's status in life. Those who did own land were careful to maintain and enhance their wealth and social standing. By having their children marry into other land-owning families, they assured themselves a continued life of leisure. This class distinction, and the importance it held in 18th century England, promoted greed, snobbery, and, of course, pride and prejudice. It is the challenge of the hero and the heroine in the novel to overcome those flaws, and to do so through the use of their intelligence and through the stronger force of their deep love for each other. Pride and Prejudice begins with a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet tells her husband that a Mr. Bingley, a young bachelor, has moved into a nearby house. This is exciting news for Mrs. Bennet, because her only goal in life is to see that her 5 unmarried daughters find husbands, preferably husbands of wealth and standing. She wants her husband to meet Mr. Bingley quickly, before her friends William and Lady Lucas, who also have marriageable daughters, can do so. Mr. Bennet teases his wife by telling her he has no intention of visiting Mr. Bingley. He considers his wife and daughters, with the exception of his second daughter, Elizabeth, silly and ignorant, and is amused by his wife's ambition to see their daughters married well. However, Mr. Bennet does visit Mr. Bingley, but Mr. Bingley is unable to accept a dinner invitation from the Bennets because he must go to London. Mr. Bennet tells his wife nothing about Bingley, but she finds out from Lady Lucas that Bingley is not only rich, he is handsome, gracious, and fond of dancing. In typical logic, she points out that anyone fond of dancing is undoubtedly more likely to fall in love. Finally, a ball given in town provides the people of Meryton a chance to meet Mr. Bingley and his party. Bingley proves to be extremely eligible. He's good-looking, gentlemanly, polite, and sociable. Mr. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, also draws attention because he is tall and handsome, and reputedly even richer than Bingley. But soon it becomes clear that he is also uncommonly proud and disagreeable. He particularly upsets Elizabeth Bennet when she overhears him commenting that he would not dance with her because, in his words, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." Meanwhile, Mr. Bingley is obviously attracted to Jane, the eldest Bennet daughter. He makes the extraordinary move of dancing with her twice. Mrs. Bennet is already anticipating their marriage. Jane is excited about Mr. Bingley, but Elizabeth warns her about her tendency to overestimate people. Lizzie, as she is also called, approves of Bingley, but feels that Bingley's sisters are conceited. The Bingleys have money, but are not one of the great land-holding families of England, and this embarrasses the Bingley sisters. Although Darcy's personality seems disagreeable to most people, Bingley admires Darcy's intelligence and is greatly influenced by him. Darcy tells Bingley that he approves of Jane, and that he isn't impressed by the overall quality of the people attending the ball. At this point, it's becoming obvious that Darcy and Elizabeth are the brightest and most influential characters in the book. As Darcy gets to know Elizabeth, he becomes more attracted to her looks and spirit. At a later party, he finally asks her to dance. Elizabeth refuses, remembering his previous insult. They have a discussion about each other's faults, a discussion that is both playful and serious. Here is an excerpt, beginning with Darcy. "My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever." "That is a failing indeed," cried Elizabeth. "Implacable resentment is a shade in a character, but you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me." Darcy continues. "There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome." "And," says Elizabeth, "your defect is a propensity to hate everybody." "And yours," he replied with a smile, "is willfully to misunderstand them." Later, Darcy comments to Bingley's sister Caroline that he finds Elizabeth pleasing. Having designs on Darcy herself, Caroline tells him that the Bennets are inferior people, and that the crude Mrs. Bennet would not make a desirable mother-in-law. At this point, we learn that the Bennet property has been willed to Mr. Bennet, but at his death must be passed on to another male member of his family, since he has no sons. Thus, the girls have no inheritance with which to attract a husband. As the story continues, Jane is invited to visit the Bingley sisters at Netherfield, about 3 miles away. Mrs. Bennet sends her by horseback rather than carriage, so that if it rains, she'll be invited to stay the night. The next morning, Elizabeth receives a message from Jane saying that she has caught cold in the rain and is unable to leave Netherfield, just as her mother had hoped. Elizabeth immediately decides to visit her. She walks the 3 miles to Netherfield and arrives covered with mud and dust. The Bingley sisters are shocked by her appearance, but Darcy, who is staying at the Bingley home, is struck by her beauty and devotion. Elizabeth is invited to spend the night to help care for Jane. After dinner, and after Elizabeth has gone back to Jane's room, the Bingley sisters continue to verbally attack the Bennet family. And while Bingley is not concerned by the Bennet family's low connections, Darcy admits that their social status does lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. It is apparent that social differences will be a major barrier to Darcy's interest in Elizabeth. Caroline Bingley continues her assault on the Bennet family as part of her attempt to win favor with Darcy. She's becoming more and more jealous of Elizabeth's presence, even though Elizabeth thinks the looks she occasionally gets from Darcy are those of criticism. Darcy, however, is becoming increasingly attracted to Elizabeth, and Caroline knows she can't compete. Elizabeth, however, wants nothing to do with Darcy. She thinks he still dislikes her, and still finds him prideful and condescending. After Elizabeth returns home, Mr. Bennet reveals to the girls that Mr. Collins, a cousin, will be the one who inherits his estate when he dies. Mr. Collins has been ordained in the Church of England, and will be taking over a village parish thanks to the patronage of a Lady Catherine de Bourgh. This means he will be provided with a good salary. Collins has written a letter apologizing for the circumstances that disinherit Bennet's daughters, but says he will make amends. To do that, he is coming to visit the Bennets. Collins, who turns out to be a self-important prig, hopes to make his amends by marrying one of the Bennet daughters. He's attracted to Jane, but Mrs. Bennet tells him Jane is about to be engaged, so he switches his attention to Elizabeth. In the morning, Collins walks to Meryton with Jane, Elizabeth, and their two younger sisters, Kitty and Lydia. There they meet a Mr. Wickham, who is an army officer. Lydia, the most frivolous and shallow of the sisters, is attracted to Wickham. Wickham, who has just joined the regiment, is handsome and polite, and possesses the ability to charm people, particularly women. Just then, Darcy and Bingley ride up, and Elizabeth notices that Darcy and Wickham are surprised and embarrassed to see each other. She wonders why. At a dinner party at her aunt's the next evening, Elizabeth and Wickham strike up a conversation. Elizabeth, too, finds the young officer attractive. Wickham claims he has been deprived of a lucrative position in the church by Darcy. Wickham explains that Darcy's father was his godfather, and out of friendship for Wickham's father, had promised informally to give Wickham a very fine parish. Darcy, however, disregarded his father's wishes and refused Wickham the commission. As a result, he has been forced to choose a military life. Elizabeth immediately wants to tell the world about Darcy's treachery, but Wickham, out of respect for his father, tells her he would never expose Darcy. Wickham also tells Elizabeth that Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the woman who has provided the patronage for Mr. Collins to get his parish, is Darcy's aunt. At this point, Elizabeth doesn't really know either Darcy or Wickham well, but she is forming strong opinions on both. Her opinions have been formed by circumstances and by a few personality traits in each man. A few days later, the Bingleys invite the Bennet family to a ball at Netherfield. Elizabeth is looking forward to dancing with Wickham, but when she arrives, she is told by a friend of his that Wickham is not attending because he wants to avoid Darcy. This increases her dislike for Darcy. At the ball, Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance, and, caught by surprise, she agrees. She purposely tells him she has met Wickham, and Darcy responds, "He cannot keep friends as easily as he makes them." Elizabeth is cold and aloof during the dance, but Darcy still feels a growing interest in her. Although Bingley and his sister both tell Elizabeth that Wickham was responsible himself for losing his church position, Elizabeth doesn't believe it. She believes they're prejudiced against Wickham. As the ball winds down, Darcy is repulsed when he hears Mrs. Bennet bragging about the upcoming marriage of her daughter Jane to Bingley, even though they're not even engaged. And to make matters worse, Elizabeth's younger sister Mary annoys everyone in attendance with a bad singing performance. When the Bennets finally leave, Elizabeth is thinking how crudely her family has behaved. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins has decided he wants to marry Elizabeth, and even though she turns him down several times, he won't accept her refusal. He thinks so much of himself that he can't imagine anyone rejecting him, and so he points out to Elizabeth that with her slight inheritance, she might not get another opportunity for marriage. Finally, when Elizabeth still doesn't relent, he withdraws his proposal, much to the disappointment of Mrs. Bennet. This incident emphasizes Mrs. Bennet's selfishness and disregard for the feelings of her own daughters. Mr. Bennet is not perturbed by his daughter's actions. He knows Collins doesn't love Elizabeth and will quickly recover from the rejection. A day later, Jane receives a letter from Caroline Bingley, saying that the Bingley party is moving to London, and that she is hoping Bingley will marry Georgiana Darcy, Darcy's younger sister. Elizabeth immediately understands that Caroline's plan is to prevent her brother from returning to Jane. Caroline feels the Bennets are inferior, and thinks, furthermore, that if her brother marries Georgiana, she herself will have a better chance at Darcy. Jane, who never thinks ill of anyone, doesn't suspect Caroline and fully expects Bingley to return. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's friend Charlotte Lucas is making a bid for Collins. Even though she realizes his shortcomings, she is 27 years old and believes that marriage is her only hope of security. Soon afterward, Collins proposes and Charlotte accepts. Since Elizabeth knows that Charlotte doesn't love Collins, she is disappointed in her friend and tells her so. Charlotte says she is satisfied that she has made a good business transaction. The same is true for Collins, who is marrying only because of the insistence of his patron, Lady Catherine. He has now offered marriage to 3 women in only 3 days. Lady Lucas boasts of the marriage and brags that soon her daughter will be mistress of the Bennet estate. Mrs. Bennet blames Elizabeth and complains constantly of the arrangement that keeps her husband's estate from passing down to her daughters. Soon Collins writes that Lady Catherine has approved the marriage and urges him not to delay it. After a time, Jane gets another letter from Caroline. She praises Darcy's sister and restates her hope that her brother will marry her. Elizabeth is upset by Caroline's conspiracy and doesn't believe that Bingley loves Georgiana Darcy. Jane, however, appears to take it in stride, hiding her true feelings and still refusing to believe anything bad about anyone. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is spending time with Wickham, who is spreading the story about how Darcy has wronged him. A week later, Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife, the Gardners, come to visit the Bennets for Christmas. Mr. Gardner is a successful businessman, and he and his wife are much more refined than his sister, Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Gardner has long been friendly with Jane and Elizabeth, and suggests to Elizabeth that she take Jane to London for a visit when the Gardners return home. It is agreed upon, and arrangements are made. Mrs. Gardner, who is familiar with Darcy's estate, also suggests to Elizabeth that she see less of Wickham, because his lack of fortune would make a marriage between them unworkable. Elizabeth tells her aunt she will use good judgment. Soon Mr. Collins and Charlotte are married. After the wedding, the couple heads for Hunsford Parsonage. Elizabeth says she will write to Charlotte, but inside she feels she has lost some understanding and respect for her old friend. Elizabeth receives a letter from Jane, who has visited Caroline, and now realizes that Elizabeth was right. Caroline is not her friend, and has been doing her best to keep Jane from her brother, Bingley. Near the same time, Wickham meets a girl with £10,000, and suddenly loses his interest in Elizabeth. Elizabeth decides he has the same attitude toward marriage as Charlotte Lucas, and although offended, hides it by saying she wasn't in love with him anyway. Soon it is time for Elizabeth to visit Charlotte at Hunsford. When she arrives at Hunsford with Sir William Lucas and Charlotte's younger sister, she discovers that she will be afforded the chance to meet Lady Catherine, Collins's benefactor. She will also meet Lady Catherine's frail daughter, whom her mother hopes to match with Darcy. Lady Catherine turns out to be a rude, insensitive person who ridicules the Bennets' lack of a governess, among other things. She suggests that since Elizabeth has no means, she will not be able to marry well, and should consider a career as a governess. Her daughter is shy, withdrawn, and lifeless. Elizabeth knows that Darcy could not possibly be interested in her. In this chapter, it becomes apparent that social standing has little connection with breeding or good manners. Lady Catherine is crude and offensive, as are the Bingley sisters, while the Gardners and Phillipses, supposedly of a lower class, are polite and amiable. A week before Easter, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, Lady Catherine's 2 nephews, visit her at Rosings, her estate. Mr. Collins meets them at Rosings, and brings Darcy and Fitzwilliam back to Hunsford, where Elizabeth is staying. The next week the Collinses and their guests are invited to Rosings again, and again Lady Catherine insults Elizabeth, which seems to upset her nephew Darcy. Despite the time that has passed, Elizabeth is still not ready to forgive Darcy for slighting her the first time they met. She tells the story to Colonel Fitzwilliam. Fitzwilliam reports this to Darcy, who lamely tries to defend himself. Ironically, every time Elizabeth engages Darcy in a verbal duel, it heightens her interest in him. The next morning, the two have a long talk. Darcy tells Elizabeth that he doesn't expect Bingley to ever return to Netherfield, and indicates that he considers him to be of a superior class to the people in Elizabeth's village. Darcy visits Elizabeth several times, always in the company of others, which prompts Charlotte to tell Elizabeth that Darcy's visits reveal a love for her. Elizabeth discounts Charlotte's idea. After a later discussion with Darcy, Elizabeth decides that it is he, not his sister, who has convinced Bingley to break off his relationship with Jane. His motive was partially the inferiority of the Bennet family, because, after all, they do have one uncle who is a country attorney, Mr. Phillips, and one who is a London businessman, Mr. Gardner. And people who worked for a living, no matter how successful, were considered below the landowning classes. But Elizabeth also believes that Darcy is hoping to marry Mr. Bingley to his own sister. Upset, she decides not to go on a planned outing to Rosings that afternoon. While sitting alone in the parsonage, Elizabeth is suddenly confronted by Darcy. At first he inquires about her health, then he suddenly professes his love for her. He says, "In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Darcy asks for Elizabeth's hand in marriage. However, he phrases the proposal in such a way as to anger Elizabeth. Darcy says that he has long fought with his pride because of her social inferiority, and that having his family linked to hers would be socially degrading. Insulted, Elizabeth rejects Darcy, and to add insult to injury, she tells him she has no feelings for him and berates him for breaking up her sister's relationship with Bingley. Here is an excerpt from their conversation. "I might as well inquire," replied she, "why, with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you choose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility, if I was uncivil? But I have other provocations. You know I have. Had not my own feelings decided against you, had they been indifferent, or had they even been favorable, do you think that any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister?" As she pronounced these words, Mr. Darcy changed color, but the emotion was short, and he listened without attempting to interrupt her while she continued. "I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted there. You dare not, you cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means, of dividing them from each other, or exposing one to the censure of the world for caprice and instability, the other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery of the acutest kind." She paused, and saw with no slight indignation that he was listening with an air which proved him wholly unmoved by any feeling of remorse. He even looked at her with a smile of affected incredulity. "Can you deny that you have done it?" she repeated. With assumed tranquillity, he then replied, "I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Towards him I have been kinder than towards myself." Darcy continues by saying Elizabeth has turned him down simply because he had waited so long to ask for her hand. She answers that no matter how or when he would have asked her, she would not have accepted. And she says that she's rejecting him because of his arrogance and pride. A stunned Darcy leaves abruptly. By rejecting Darcy, Elizabeth has behaved unconventionally, to say the least. Few women of her time would have been able to resist such an offer, since he offered wealth and family status. But Elizabeth's pride and self-esteem prohibited even the consideration of such a proposal. The next morning, Darcy hands Elizabeth a letter and leaves. In the letter, he claims that he helped prevent the marriage of Jane and Bingley because he didn't think Jane had any special feeling for Bingley. And he also admits that he was repelled by the gauche attitudes of her mother and her younger sisters. He further admits to conspiring with Bingley's sisters to prevent Bingley's return from London, and to convincing Bingley that Jane was interested in him for his social status only. He also reveals that he did not tell Bingley that Jane was visiting in London, and that this is why he never tried to see her. In the letter, Darcy also explains the Wickham incident, because he doesn't want anyone thinking he has violated his father's wishes. He writes that Wickham, after being supported by the elder Darcy in hopes that he would enter the church, decided instead to take up law. Wickham informed Darcy of his decision and agreed to give up all claims to his church position for £3,000. After squandering the money over a 3-year period, Wickham wrote to Darcy to try and reclaim his church position. Darcy refused. Wickham then tried to get revenge and a share of Darcy's estate by eloping with Darcy's sister, but Darcy found out in time and blocked the marriage. He closed the letter by telling Elizabeth she can confirm the story by consulting Fitzwilliam. After carefully evaluating the facts in Darcy's letters, Elizabeth realizes in horror that she has been wrong about Darcy, and what she thought to be her keen sense of judgment has proven fallible. An excerpt from the book reads this way. "How despicably have I acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself." Later that week, after having thought over all that had happened, and deciding that much of it had been caused by the deplorable actions of her own family, Elizabeth begins the journey home, thoroughly depressed. She isn't sorry she didn't accept Darcy's proposal, but she is sorry for having caused him grief. She does know, however, that Bingley is not to blame for leaving Jane. Austen describes to us how Elizabeth's feelings are beginning to change. Mr. Darcy's letters she was in a fair way of soon knowing by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings towards its writer were at times widely different. When she remembered the style of his address, she was still full of indignation, but when she considered how unjustly she had condemned and upbraided him, her anger was turned against herself, and his disappointed feelings became the object of compassion. His attachment excited gratitude, his general character respect. But she could not approve him, nor could she for a moment repent her refusal, or feel the slightest inclination ever to see him again. In her own past behavior there was a constant source of vexation and regret, and in the unhappy defects of her family a subject of yet heavier chagrin. They were hopeless of remedy. After arriving home, Elizabeth tells Jane what she has discovered, and says that her dislike for Darcy is unfounded, and that Wickham is not what they had believed him to be. They agree not to say anything about Wickham to the rest of the family. About that time, the regiment is about to leave town, and the younger Bennet daughters, Lydia and Kitty, are distressed. Their chief occupation in life has been pursuing and flirting with the soldiers. Lydia receives an invitation from Colonel Forster's wife to accompany her to Brighton. Knowing the trip will be imprudent, even dangerous because of Lydia's flirtatious nature, Elizabeth warns her father not to let her go. But rather than start a family war, he agrees to allow the trip. At this time, Wickham has also shown a renewed interest in Elizabeth, but of course Elizabeth is not interested, and she indirectly suggests to him that she now knows the true story about his past with the Darcys. Meanwhile, Elizabeth has been invited to take a trip with her aunt and uncle Gardiner to Derbyshire, which is near Pemberley, Darcy's estate. When in Derbyshire, the Gardiners decide to visit Pemberley. At first Elizabeth decides not to go, but then she discovers that Darcy is out of town. While at the estate, the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, lavishly praises Darcy, commenting on his good looks, generosity, and his even disposition. Elizabeth cannot believe this is the same Darcy she knows. As they are walking across the lawn from the house, Darcy suddenly appears. Business has brought him home sooner than intended. Darcy treats Elizabeth courteously, then leaves. Later, as they explore the beautiful estate, they see Darcy again. He politely asks to be introduced to her friends. Darcy is obviously surprised by their intelligence, taste, and good breeding. Darcy invites Mr. Gardiner to fish in his stream while he's visiting. Elizabeth again can't believe this is the same Darcy. She also meets Darcy's 16-year-old sister Georgiana, whom she likes very much. Bingley and his sisters are also there, and Elizabeth notes that Bingley is as pleasant as ever. She wonders if he still loves Jane. After Elizabeth leaves, Caroline Bingley attacks her verbally, but Darcy responds by calling Elizabeth one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. By this time, the Gardiners are aware that Darcy is in love with Elizabeth, and are eager to talk with him about her. The next morning, Elizabeth receives 2 letters from Jane. One had been misdirected. The first says that Lydia has run off to Scotland with Wickham. Kitty had known about it, but told no one. In the second letter, Jane states that everyone is sure that Wickham doesn't intend to marry Lydia. Other information from Colonel Forster seems to point to London as Lydia's destination, not Scotland. The letter also asks Elizabeth to come home to help resolve the crisis. Elizabeth blames herself for not telling her family about Wickham's character, and she's certain that such a scandal will appall Darcy. She's weeping over Jane's letter when Darcy himself enters. Austen describes their encounter this way. Darcy, in wretched suspense, could only say something indistinctly of his concern, and observe her in compassionate silence. At length she spoke. "I have just had a letter from Jane with such dreadful news. It cannot be concealed from anyone. My youngest sister has left all her friends, has eloped, has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They are gone off together from Brighton. You know him too well to doubt the rest. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to... She is lost forever." Darcy was fixed in astonishment. "When I consider," she added in a yet more agitated voice, "that I might have prevented it, I who knew what he was. Had I but explained some part of it only, some part of what I learned to my own family. Had his character been known, this could not have happened. But it is all too late now." Darcy seemed scarcely to hear her, and was walking up and down the room in earnest meditation, his brow contracted, his air gloomy. Elizabeth soon observed, and instantly understood it. Her power was sinking. Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. She could neither wonder nor condemn, but the belief of his self-conquest brought nothing conciliatory to her bosom, afforded no palliation of her distress. It was, on the contrary, exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes. And never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be in vain. Upon arriving home, nothing has been heard from Lydia. Her father is still in London searching for her, and her mother is blaming everyone but herself for the disaster, even though it was she who encouraged Lydia to go to Brighton. Meanwhile, it surfaces that Wickham has bad debts in Meryton and elsewhere, and there are dark rumors of his previous seductions. There seems little doubt that Wickham doesn't intend to marry Lydia, particularly since she has no money. After looking for Lydia for several days, Mr. Bennet is urged by Colonel Forster, who's directing the search, to go home. When he arrives, Mr. Bennet tells Elizabeth that Lydia's plight is his fault. Elizabeth had begged him not to let Lydia go to Brighton, but he hadn't listened. Eventually, Lydia and Wickham are found, and a settlement is arranged, supposedly by Mr. Gardner. Wickham, who at first had refused to marry Lydia, will do so on two conditions. First, she must be willed 1,000 of the £5,000 that will be divided among the 5 daughters at Mr. Bennet's death. And second, she is to receive £100 per year while he lives. There is supposedly enough money to pay Mr. Wickham's debts, plus some left over. Mr. Bennet has no choice but to agree to the terms. If he doesn't, his daughter will be disgraced and forced by society to either spend her life as a spinster or to marry someone of a lower social class. Mr. Bennet also believes that Mr. Gardner has actually given Wickham a great deal more money to agree to the marriage. The sum seems inadequate for Wickham's greedy nature, and he suspects Gardner isn't telling him the entire truth. Mrs. Bennet is delighted with Lydia's impending marriage, but Elizabeth feels sorry for Lydia, realizing she has to accept a marriage where there will be little chance for happiness. She also feels a little sorry for herself, because she is certain that Darcy would never marry into a family that included Wickham. Ironically, this realization comes at the time she finally understands that she and Darcy are made for each other. Lydia shows no remorse for her actions. When she and Wickham visit the Bennets after their marriage, she suggests that her sisters should go to Brighton and get a husband like she did. Elizabeth answers that she doesn't particularly like Lydia's way of finding a husband. While visiting, Lydia mentions that Darcy was at her wedding. This shocks Elizabeth, since that was the last place she expected him to be. She writes to Mrs. Gardner to find out what it means. She gets a letter back immediately, saying that it was Darcy who financed the marriage settlement, not Mr. Gardner. Darcy felt responsible for the Bennet family's lack of information on Wickham, and had convinced Wickham to agree to the terms. Elizabeth wonders if that was enough motivation to make Darcy bargain with a man he despises. She thinks briefly that he may have done it because he loves her, but puts that thought out of her mind when she thinks how disgusting Darcy would find it to become Wickham's brother-in-law. Meanwhile, word comes that Mr. Bingley is to arrive at Netherfield in a day or two. Jane is excited by the news. 3 days after he arrives, he and Darcy visit the Bennets. It is immediately apparent that Bingley and Jane still take joy in each other's company. Bingley and Darcy dine with the Bennets at Longbourn. Bingley sits beside Jane, but Darcy doesn't sit anywhere near Elizabeth. She thinks Darcy is keeping his distance from her because she has refused him. 2 days later, Bingley proposes to Jane. Elizabeth smiles to herself at how quickly and easily this romance has finally been settled, after a wait of almost a year. Jane's impending marriage makes everyone forget about Lydia's disgrace. About a week after Jane's engagement, Lady Catherine de Bourgh shows up at the Bennet home and asks to speak to Elizabeth. She tells Elizabeth that her daughter and Darcy are intended for each other, and warns Elizabeth to stay away from Darcy. Of course, Elizabeth admits to nothing and makes no promises to the lady. Here is an excerpt from their fiery encounter. "Neither duty, not honor, nor gratitude," replied Elizabeth, "have any possible claim on me in the present instance. No principle of either would be violated by my marriage with Mr. Darcy. And with regard to the resentment of his family, or the indignation of the world, if the former were excited by his marrying me, it would not give me one moment's concern, and the world in general would have too much sense to join in the scorn." "And this is your real opinion? This is your final resolve? Very well. I shall now know how to act. Do not imagine, Miss Bennet, that your ambition will ever be gratified. I came to try you. I hope to find you reasonable, but depend upon it, I will carry my point." In this manner, Lady Catherine talked on, till they were at the door of the carriage, when, turning hastily around, she added, "I take no leave of you, Miss Bennet. I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. I am most seriously displeased." After failing to browbeat Elizabeth, Lady Catherine drives away in a huff. Following the lady's warning to Elizabeth, Collins comes by to issue another warning, no doubt at the lady's request. In a few days, Darcy returns to Netherfield and comes to visit the Bennets. Darcy and Elizabeth soon find themselves alone. Explaining that she knows what Darcy has done for Lydia, Elizabeth thanks Darcy for his kindness. Darcy immediately tells Elizabeth he did it all for her. Then he says that he has the same wishes and intentions that he had when he proposed in April. This time, Elizabeth accepts his proposal. The two then express regret for their past pride and prejudices. Darcy tells how on his recent visit to the Bennets, he noticed Jane's true regard for Bingley and realized he had been wrong. It was only his keen observation of Bingley and Jane that kept him from paying much attention to Elizabeth. Elizabeth's next concern is how her family will accept Darcy, a man they all dislike because of the misinformation they have been given about him. Her toughest battle is with Jane, who at first can't believe she really loves Darcy. Finally, Elizabeth convinces her. The next step is to tell her father, who still believes that she hates Darcy. Darcy tells Mr. Bennet of their hopes of marriage, and Bennet then calls for Elizabeth. Elizabeth tells him the whole story, assures him she's not marrying the wrong man, and that she has spent many months growing to love Darcy. Mr. Bennet is relieved, and jokes that if any young men come for Mary or Kitty, he is quite ready to receive them. Mrs. Bennet, of course, is her same vain self. She carries on about how rich Elizabeth will be. Elizabeth now playfully tries to find out from Darcy what made him fall in love with her. He says he admired her intelligence and her spunk. Ironically, both credit Lady Catherine's meddling with helping their romance. Finally, the two Bennets, Darcy and Elizabeth, move into Pemberley, and Darcy's sister, Georgiana, comes to live with them. After a year, Jane and Bingley finally get their own estate about 30 miles from Pemberley, and the two sisters are frequently together. In order to further Kitty's education, Elizabeth spends much time with her younger sister. Mary remains at home. Elizabeth does what she can to help the extravagant Wickhams. Darcy doesn't allow Wickham to visit Pemberley, but does help him further his army career. The Wickhams' marital affection for each other is soon gone, as is their hope for a happy life. Darcy and Elizabeth maintain their relationship with the Gardiners, realizing that they would never have been married without their help. And eventually, even Darcy and Lady Catherine get back on speaking terms. For overcoming their pride and prejudice, Both Elizabeth and Darcy have been rewarded with greater self-awareness and with a true and lasting love. Pride and Prejudice demonstrates what can happen when people deceive themselves or allow themselves to be deceived by the false standards of society. Darcy's exaggerated sense of superiority immediately alienates him from Elizabeth. She, in turn, is so insulted by his indifference that she's willing to believe Wickham's lies about Darcy. Then, when Darcy tries to propose to Elizabeth, he is so preoccupied with his station in life that he inadvertently insults her. But it is Elizabeth's refusal that leads to his self-examination and helps him realize the nature of true love. From then on, Darcy recognizes Elizabeth's self-worth and acknowledges her qualities, qualities that transcend social status. Darcy realizes that he has indeed found a woman of quality. Jane Austen exposes the shallowness and vanities of the society of her time, but she also takes a practical view of the relationships between the classes. She's aware that men and women had to accept a powerlessness and dependency and were required to provide themselves with security. However, the character of Elizabeth shows that quality is an individual characteristic and has little to do with family background or social status, and that intelligence, common sense, and love can triumph over the imposed and arbitrary standards of class and society. Elizabeth shows much more breeding than Bingley's sisters or Lady Catherine, and Darcy eventually comes to realize this. As a result, he can overlook the shameful behavior of Elizabeth's mother and younger sisters. Jane Austen makes a strong commentary on selfishness versus selflessness, and offers many examples of selfless love and its effectiveness. Both Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Lucas, in their selfish desires to push their daughters into impressive marriages, eventually lead their daughters into unhappy, even tragic ends. Jane and Elizabeth, who loved each other selflessly and who held out for men they truly loved, were rewarded with happy, fulfilling marriages. Even Mr. Bennet is an example of the dangers of ill-conceived marriages. He married his wife only because of her beauty, and was condemned to a life with a woman with whom he had nothing in common, and for whom he had neither respect nor affection. Today we no longer have the strong barriers between classes that existed in 18th century England, nor do women have the same dependency on marriage and men. But the human motivations and behaviors explored by Jane Austen remain unchanged. Pride and personal prejudices still interfere with honest communication and with our honest appraisals of each other. And self-awareness and love still remain the only hope for transcending our own limitations and the false expectations of society. In that sense, Pride and Prejudice remains timeless, still entertaining and enlightening us 200 years after Jane Austen wrote it.
This is the end of the session.